Please be seated. Defense is ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Thank you. April 25th of 2014 was the most terrifying moment of Armando Baptista's life. Armando is sitting in the passenger seat of that car. He is heading home to his wife and kids when his door opens and a 6'2", 228-pound stranger comes into the car and starts beating on him. The stranger gets a bottle, hits Armando over the head a couple of times, and the bottle breaks. The stranger then has the neck of the bottle in his hand, and he's using the neck of that bottle to try to stab Armando. Armando is screaming, "Help! Help! Who is this, G? Who is this? Please stop." But no one can help him. Demetrius is in the driver's seat of that car. He's obviously ineffective from where he is. He can't reach over to where this stranger is attacking Armando. Armando is trapped. He's covered in broken glass. He thinks he is going to die. So he does the only thing he can think of. He pulls out the little pocket knife that he's got in his pocket that he uses for work, and he stabs the man to try to get him off of him. He just wants the man to stop. But the attacker doesn't slow down. The knife doesn't do anything to him. He keeps coming, and Armando is still trapped. This stranger, hopped up on flakka and cocaine and 0.08 alcohol level, doesn't stop. And Armando needs his second hand. I mean, the knife literally is not doing anything. And he makes the conscious, calculated decision. He needs his second hand to stop this man with the neck of the bottle. So he throws the knife. So he can grab the man's hand with his other hand and try to use his two hands to prevent himself from being stabbed to death. It probably only takes Demetrius, the driver, a few seconds to get out of the car, to walk around the car, to try to stop the attacker. But to Armando, that seemed like a lifetime. Demetrius tries at first to pull that passenger off, right? But he's to pull the attacker off. But compared to that attacker, Demetrius is tiny. And he's weak. And he can't do anything. And Demetrius hears Armando screaming, "Help me! He's going to kill me!" And Demetrius does the only thing he can think of. He picks up the knife, stabs the man once in the back, and that ends it. The man arches his back and walks away. Armando slams the door shut. Demetrius gets back into the car, and they drive away from the man that just attacked him. Left behind, right there, right at where the open passenger door would have been, is the neck of the beer bottle that the attacker tried to use to stab him, is the hat Armando had been wearing that got knocked off his head by the attacker. Armando Baptista had absolutely no reason to stab this man except in self-defense. When Armando gets arrested, he tells the state attorney's office, "I want to talk. I want to tell you what happened. He was offered nothing. He gets nothing out of it. But he voluntarily, while he's in his jail suit, voluntarily gets taken to the state attorney's office to tell them what happened. And here's what he says.
Yes. And we pull up this stop sign in Landmark Parkway. It's a two-way street. So we made it for the traffic to stop so we can go across and make a left.
I think we're having trouble here. Start over with higher volume, please.
The traffic stop and the door just swung open. And the man was standing there. He just looked by the time I finished to turn around. And I'm like, oh, he's up there saying, what the hell? He was on. I seen his hands come around. His right hand come around. I didn't know what it was. But he hit me in the head, then I realized it was the ball. He hit me twice in the head. And the ball was broke the second time. By that time, the ball was broke. I don't know if you can get it. By the time the ball was broke, I jumped out my knife. And I just started stabbing him. I didn't know where I stabbed him. I don't know where I stabbed him. And I was holding, grabbed his arms. Because he had the broken glass coming in. So I grabbed his arms. And then I had to do nothing, so they didn't stop him. So I had his arms and he was just going over. I'm trying to stop the ball from coming in. Took a piece of my leg, a piece of all, trying to stick the balls, the glass ball in my face. And I had to pick my knife because he didn't do nothing to him. I wasn't strong enough to hold him in my hand. So I had to pick my knife and I grabbed him with both hands. And this time he had both his hands. But this one, he had the ball. The both the ball was like this close to my face. And I'm holding it and I'm screaming for help. And I'm screaming for help. And I'm telling him, please stop, please stop. And he was just determined. Like, he had the look in his face. I don't know what he was on, but I don't know. I kept screaming, and he wouldn't stop. And that's when Demetrius came and stabbed him in the back. And he just looked at this. And he backed up. That's when I closed the door real quick. And Demetrius got in the car and we left.
So you said that you saw Demetrius stabbed him in the back?
I didn't see him. He told me afterwards that he stabbed him back. He was coming, when I was holding him like this, it was like, you wouldn't stop, you wouldn't stop. And I kept screaming for help, and screaming for help, and screaming for help. And then he went like this, he was like, oh. And he just, so he stepped back. I was going to close the door. Then I see Demetrius get in the car. And we left. And Demetrius said he had a stab in his back. He said he had to because if he didn't, well, if he didn't, I would not be here. Because
Ladies and gentlemen, this was self-defense. Now, I'm going to spend a whole lot of time talking about all of the facts in this case. But before I do that, we need to make very, very clear what your job is going to be. You do not have to go in there and figure out what happened that day. Nowhere in the instructions that the judge gave you did he tell you that you have to figure out what happened at that stop sign at Miramar Parkway and Terra Way. The only question that you have to answer is whether the state has proven to you beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt that Armando was not acting in self-defense. We don't have to prove anything. And if you get into that room, and you guys can talk for as long as you want, and you can look at the evidence for as long as you want, and if you can look at, you can spend days back there if you like. And if at the end of it you can't figure out what happened, you don't have to. The only question you have to answer is whether they've proven to you this is beyond a reasonable doubt, and they haven't. They can't prove to you this wasn't self-defense, because it absolutely was self-defense. So let's talk about the facts. I want to start by talking about a bunch of the facts that I think we agree on. Think. Fact number one, Mohammed Knight got out of that car and approached the passenger side of Armando's car. We know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. The question is, why? Why is he walking towards Armando's car? Walking towards to where Armando is sitting. He didn't know Armando and Demetrius. He had no legitimate reason to walk up to that car. Now, we don't know for sure what was going on in Mohammed Knight's mind. We do know that just moments earlier, Mr. Knight had specifically asked Walter Stanley, do you want me to dust that guy up? Now Walter says no. But moments before he gets out of the car and walks towards Armando, he's asking somebody else, do you want me to beat Armando up? We also know that when Mr. Knight gets out of that car, he screams, he yells, Walt. Walt. There's only one logical, reasonable conclusion there. Mohammed got out of his car in order to confront Armando Baptista for what Armando had did to Walt. And he's shouting at Walt back at the house to let him know that's what he's doing. Now, Ms. Gambolas tries to say, well, there could have been two Walts. He could have thought there was a second Walt in the car in front of him. That is simply not believable. It's not reasonable because it didn't happen. Fact number one, Mohammed Knight got out of that car and walked towards Armando's car. Fact number two, Mohammed Knight was inside that car on top of Armando. You know that. Everyone that experienced this encounter says that that happened, and they don't want to talk about it. Wendy says he was in there, Demetrius says he was in there, and Armando says he was in there. All of them saying he was on top of Armando Baptista. The only difference between Wendy's testimony and Armando and Demetrius' testimony on that is how he got in there. Armando and Demetrius told you how he got in there. Wendy didn't. Wendy didn't give you a single theory or reason or explain to you at all how he got into that car. Because there was no legitimate way he gets into that car unless he's attacking Armando Baptista. Fact number three, that I think we agree on. The drugs that Mohammed Knight was on that night. He had flakka running through his system. He had cocaine running through his system. He had marijuana running through his system. And he had a .08 blood alcohol level. Too drunk to drive. We know that cocaine is a stimulant. It creates a fight-or-flight syndrome. And here's what we know from Dr. Clinton about flakka. It creates extreme paranoia. It makes people think they are being chased by non-existent attackers or extraterrestrials. It's a hallucinogen. People on flakka are in a completely altered state of reality. It gives people a sense of super strength in the sense that they don't feel pain. So when Armando is stabbing him, he's not feeling it. That's why he's continuing his attack. We know that first responders who are encountering people on flakka literally have to use other drugs to sedate them, to get them under control. No one can testify, and we cannot begin to imagine what is going on in the mind of someone who is under that drug, who is under the influence of that drug cocktail. Flakka, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol. But Armando saw it. He saw it firsthand when he looked into that man's eyes that was attacking him and said to himself, "Oh Lord, what is this man on?" Fact number 4 that I think we agree on. The inside passenger seat of this car is covered in blood. There's blood on the seat itself. There's blood on the side of the seat. There's blood on the headrest. There's blood on the door frame. There's a picture of the door frame. There's blood on the center console. There's more blood on the headrest. There's blood on the side of the glove compartment. There's blood at the bottom of the back of the passenger seat. An entire, essentially, puddle of blood. There's blood on the door frame. There's blood on the side of the seat. The amount of blood that's inside that passenger seat leads to only one conclusion. Muhammad Knight is stabbed while he's inside that passenger seat on top of Armando Baptista. And Mr. Knight had no legal justification for being inside that car. This blood tells the story of the horror of what Armando Baptista was going through that night. And it's all over the inside of that passenger seat. Fact number 5. The broken beer bottle. Fact number 5, I think we agree on. The broken beer bottle. No. There's a broken beer bottle found, there's a neck of a broken beer bottle found on scene. There it is. There's the location showing it's right outside the passenger, where a passenger side door would be at the intersection. And we know there's a bottle of the beer bottle found inside the passenger seat. Now, Wendy says she never saw a bottle. Says
I thought so.
that entire time I didn't ever see a bottle. But it was there. State doesn't want to talk about what that bottle means because they have not and cannot explain away that broken bottle. It fits perfectly with what Armando and Demetrius are saying. The fact that the bottom of the broken beer bottle is inside that car proves the bottle was broken inside the car. Mr. Knight was punching Armando, leaning in, using the bottle to strike him, and that is how that bottle breaks. There is simply no theory the state could come up with to explain that bottle away that doesn't make Mr. Knight look like the aggressor. The neck of the bottle is found right outside the passenger seat, right where somebody standing would have been striking him and then dropping it. The bottom of the beer bottle is found right on the passenger seat, right where somebody would have been struck by it. Now, we know that Demetrius's DNA is found on the bottle. Now, Demetrius is never ever suspected of using that bottle at any time during this altercation. So it's very, very important to know exactly where that DNA was found. And the answer to that is it was found right on the spout of the bottle itself. She said, Pluso said she swabbed right around the outside and right around the inside. She didn't swab this part. She didn't swab the bottom part, or at least they didn't test those parts. But that DNA is right where somebody would have drank out of it. Which is frankly the most likely way that Mr. Knight got the bottle. We know that there's bottle caps inside the little cup holder there. We know that he's got a whole bunch of stuff in his car. I think Mr. Knight opened that door, began pummeling Armando, picked up the bottle, and began striking him with it. There is simply no theory that the state has provided that tells us anything other than self-defense. What would have been helpful is if the police had told you, if the police had tested the fingerprint that they found on the neck of on the spout of the bottle, or the DNA from the bottle itself. Let's start with the fingerprint. Remember, this is what we created when Officer Peluso was on the scene. Officer Peluso collects the beer bottle 426. She swabs the spout for DNA on 430. And in 430, she puts it in the fuming chamber, and her testimony, not mine, and I made sure to make sure that that's what her testimony was, latent fingerprint observed. That's what she said on the direct when the state was first asking her questions. That's what she said on cross when I was asking her questions. And then on redirect, she tried to waver a little bit and say, well, I don't actually know it was a fingerprint. But on 430, she puts it in the fuming chamber, she observes a latent fingerprint, and then does nothing with it. She puts it in a box, she puts it in an evidence locker somewhere where it sits, and who knows what happens to it. 521, she says Caceres picks it up. Then, Detective Christian says on June 22nd, so this is April, May, almost 2 full months following when the fingerprint was first detected. Now Christian says he takes possession of the beer bottle and there's no fingerprint on it. He also says that he didn't, that he saw the super glue left on the bottle, but didn't think that it was enough to test it for him. He admitted he didn't put that in his report. In his entire police report, nowhere does it mention, I saw a fingerprint, I saw some sort of ridge detail, I examined it to see if it was a fingerprint, it wasn't a fingerprint. No, all he says is, I took possession of the bottle, there was no fingerprint. So what happens to that? What happened to it? I mean, maybe it was just thrown in a locker somewhere and it's shuffled around and the glue falls off. Whatever it was, Officer Peluso should have took photographs of that, what she observed as a fingerprint on April 30th. Because guess what? That could have shown who was holding on to that bottle. And if Mr. Knight's fingerprint had been on that bottle, it would have absolutely shown this was self-defense. But they didn't do that. The state of Florida has the burden of proof in this case. They had the absolute responsibility to safeguard that fingerprint, and they didn't. They let it go to waste. Fact number 6 that I think we agree on, at least there hasn't been any evidence presented of it, and that is Armando Baptista has no motive. He has absolutely no motive to want to stab Muhammad Knight. And the reason they didn't present one, they can get up here all they want and say, we don't have to show you motive, it's not required in the instructions, and that's true. But the fact that you didn't hear evidence of a motive is absolutely something that can be considered by you. That's called a lack of evidence. And The reason they didn't present one is because there wasn't one. There's no reason for Armando Baptista to want to stab Mohammed Knight. And the fact that there was no reason for that is absolutely something you can consider in your deliberations. Why would Armando stab this man if it wasn't in self-defense? They can't answer that question. What we did hear evidence of was a motive for Mohammed Knight to want to attack Armando Baptista. Here's the following are facts, and you can make your own conclusions as to what those facts are. But the following are facts that we heard from this family. Corey calls Mohammed to come over to his house. Mohammed says no. He then calls back Corey and then tells Wendy and then says on the phone, okay, motherfucker, I'm coming over. Wendy says he's aggravated. He's angry at that. He gets to the party. Corey walks up to the car and says to Mohammed, yo, I need to talk to you. Corey and Mohammed at some point disappear into the garage. Mohammed then walks out and goes to talk to Walter. And he asks Walter. And then he and Walter then have a conversation about what had happened between Walter and Armando. And Mohammed asks Walter, do you want me to dust him up for you? Think about this for a second. Just moments before this incident, Mohammed Knight was asking somebody else if he wanted him to beat up Armando Baptista. Walter apparently thought the situation was serious enough, and Walter, for his part, said, no, I don't want you to do that. And Walter apparently thought the situation was serious enough that he tells Demetrius, you guys don't even know it, you've been set up, you need to get out of here. So Demetrius immediately grabs Armando, and they leave. And Mohammed also leaves. Mohammed Knight, at this point, with flocka and cocaine and vodka in his system, sees Demetrius and Armando sitting at that stop sign, and he gets out of the car and he shouts, "Walt!" Then walks towards Armando. Mohammed Knight had a motive for this. Armando Baptista did not. So I think that essentially concludes the facts that, the basic facts, the important facts that we agree on. You get out of the car, Mohammed got out of the car, Mohammed was on top of Armando in the passenger seat, the broken beer bottle, the drugs that Mohammed Knight was on. There are certainly a number of facts we don't agree on. And I want to start with the red Solo cup. Wendy testifies that Mohammed has a red Solo cup and not a bottle in his hand when this fight with Armando happened. That night, police find a bottle on scene, but not a red Solo cup. The next day, and by the way, not the next morning, not the next afternoon, the next night at 6 p.m., Detective Zeller and Bertrand go back to that scene. And they walk around and they magically find a red Solo cup. Now last week, Detective Zeller says they find it in the yard right there on the corner of Miramar and Terra Road. This was a problem for the state because on July 24th, in another proceeding, Detective Bertrand had testified, we found it 2 or 3 houses down on Miramar Parkway, which puts it farther and farther away from the scene itself. So then, this week, to fix this problem, Detective Bertrand comes in and changes his testimony. He says, actually, we found the cup on that house on the corner. Which is not what he said 4 months ago. And why are there conveniently no pictures of where they found the cup? We have pictures of everything else. We have pictures of where they found the bottle, the hat, the bloody stuff, but they didn't take any pictures of the location of where they found the cup. The police themselves couldn't get their story straight about where they found this red Solo cup. Nevertheless, some red Solo cup has come into evidence. And they certainly haven't done anything to prove to you that that red Solo cup had anything to do with this incident. They didn't try to test it for fingerprints to see if Mr. Knight's fingerprints were on it. They didn't try to test it for DNA to see if Mr. Knight's DNA was on it. They find it at least 20 hours later between 1 and 3 houses away. If they wanted to prove to you that that red Solo cup was relevant, they should have done so. They didn't. And one of the excuses that they give is that it costs them $100 to run a DNA test. $100. That's why they're not running their DNA tests. So why even bother? The next set of facts that we don't agree on are the stab wounds regarding the medical examiner's testimony as to what those stab wounds on Mr. Knight's body mean. Nothing in that medical examiner's testimony suggests that this was anything other than self-defense. He has injuries to his chest, to his arms, all consistent with someone reaching inside a vehicle, hitting the person inside of it, and being stabbed by the person that he's hitting. Completely consistent. Now the state tries to get him to say those are defensive wounds on his arms. But he told you, I have no idea if they were made in self-defense or not. That's what they're defined as. Any wounds on the arms, we as medical examiners are taught to classify them as defensive wounds. But Dr. Boyko told you, he has no idea whether those wounds were made in self-defense or not. Another fact that, or at least a conclusion that we disagree on, is what the blood on the outside of the car means. The state wants you to think that there is, since there's blood on the outside of the car, this means that the fight must have happened outside of the car. First of all, there's way, way, way more blood on the inside of that car. The overwhelming evidence is that he was stabbed inside the car. But look, we know because Demetrius admitted to it and told you that that he stabbed Mr. Knight outside the car. And Mr. Knight then stumbles up outside the car. So of course there's going to be a little blood on the outside of the car. That is exactly what you would expect to see. The blood on the outside of the car proves our case, not theirs. You know where they didn't find any blood? By the gas tank. Exactly where Wendy says this fight started. Down by the gas tank. The first drop, single drop of blood that they find is about halfway back on the car. And then there are some other pieces of blood around the passenger door, exactly where you would expect it. None back by the gas tank. I want to spend the next several minutes talking about Wendy Gimbolas' testimony. Because her testimony was absolutely critical for the state's case. Ms. Gimbolas' testimony was the only testimony the state presented that even remotely suggested that Armando was not acting in self-defense. So we need to go through her testimony piece by piece. I don't think that you need a close analysis of that testimony for you to make up your mind as to whether she was credible or not. But even a cursory analysis of that shows no way you can trust her with a decision of this magnitude. First, Ms. Gimbolas tells you on direct examination that Mohammed Knight was her boyfriend. But to Officer Schlosser, whom she spoke with on scene, they said they were only friends. And then she qualified that to you as, well, we were solidifying our relationship. We know that Mr. Knight was wearing a wedding ring on the night that he died. I don't know why Ms. Gambolas would want to exaggerate her relationship with him, but if she's exaggerating that, what else is she exaggerating? Let's talk about some reasons why Ms. Gambolas would lie, especially there on scene. Number one, when she first speaks to police, she doesn't know the condition that Muhammad is in. She doesn't know he's not going to survive. And she's trying to protect Muhammad. She knows that Mr. Knight got out of that car. She knows that Mr. Knight started this confrontation. She knows that Mr. Knight was inside the car, and she's worried about him getting arrested or charged with this. And so she literally tells two separate officers, she uses these words, it was self-defense. It was self-defense. Referring to Mr. Knight. She's trying to protect this man that she cares about, and then she gets locked into this story, and she can't change it. Second reason is, remember at the time, Ms. Gambolas is literally living with Mr. Knight's mom. She had just moved in. She was reliant on Mr. Knight's mom for a roof over her head. If she says what happened to the police and Mr. Knight gets charged with this, she's going to lose her place of living. And so she has this motive to lie. She tells that to the first officers to try to hide or protect Mr. Knight, and then she's locked in. You know that Ms. Gamboa simply did not see what she says she saw. You know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. First, she says that Mr. Knight was wearing tan khakis that night. I made her double down on that. I said, are you sure it was tan khakis and not camel pants? She said, no, it was tan khakis. We know he was wearing camel pants. Was she lying about that? Probably not. There's no reason for her to lie about that. But that certainly goes to show that she simply doesn't remember what she says she remembered. Number two, she testified that Armando had a big afro that night. Well, you've seen what Armando looked like right afterwards. Armando couldn't grow an afro if he tried. That's not how his hair is. She simply did not. The reason she's getting that wrong is because she didn't see Armando outside the car because he wasn't outside the car. The only time she sees him is when she walks up to that car and Mr. Knight is on top of him. And maybe she gets some sort of glimpse of him, but she certainly didn't see him outside that car. Number three, we know that because she can't identify him. She couldn't identify him in the first photo lineup. And when she came in here into this room, she couldn't identify him here during this trial. And it's not like we're hiding anything. He's the only person, not a lawyer, sitting at the defense table, but she couldn't identify him. It's because she didn't see him. She did not get a good look at him because he was never outside that car. She also stated she never saw Armando wearing a hat. She never saw a hat. Well, we know that's not true. Hat's found on scene. His DNA's on the hat. Demetrius told you he was wearing a hat. The reason she didn't see the hat is because he never got out of the car. We know next, Wendy testifies that essentially it was Muhammad that brought them to that location. And Muhammad is, without a doubt, misleading her. I mean, Muhammad is lying to her about where they're going. She says they're supposed to be going from Hallandale up to the Best Western at Sterling Road in Dania Beach. That's directly north. Muhammad says we're going to take a shortcut and takes them all the way out west in Miramar Parkway. I don't think Mr. Bowles was lying about that, but it certainly shows that Mr. Knight was lying to her about whatever was going on behind the scenes there. Next, Ms. Gamboa talks about phone calls that occurred between him and between Mr. Knight and Corey. those that are backed up by what we have in evidence. Corey calls him. He says, no, I'm not going. Mohammed calls him back, changes his mind, says, okay, mother effer, we're going. And at that point, he's aggravated. Corey clearly called Mohammed over there and convinced him to come over. Like, no idea why. No idea how. No idea what he said to Mohammed to convince him to come over. But it's very clear that Corey instigated Mohammed to come over. When they arrive at the house, as they're parking, Wendy says that Corey comes out to the vehicle and says, I got to talk to you. She specifically says she didn't get a good vibe out of Corey. Corey, of course, denies this, which very much kind of goes to the quality of the state's evidence, right? They've got their own witnesses that are contradicting each other. But what she does say is that she sees Corey point towards a bunch of people at the house and note that Armando was at that house. And, at that point, Ms. Gamboa testifies that Mr. Knight disappears inside the garage, and she's left out in the car reading her poetry book at 9:45 at night, in the dark, outside a party, while she's watching her boyfriend socialize inside. And what's important here is that Mr. Knight, excuse me, is at least for a few minutes out of sight from her. And we know, although she doesn't, that he's inside with Corey. I think that is the most likely time that Mr. Knight is using the cocaine and flopping. Whether it's mixed together, I have no idea. Mr. Knight is getting right. I can't prove that's what was happening. What I do know is that Wendy testified that earlier in the day that Mr. Knight had been hanging out with his nephew and son, and that cocaine only stays in, that amount of cocaine would have only stayed in his system, according to Dr. Koonsman, 10 to 12 hours. So is it more likely that he was using those drugs during the day while he was hanging out with his family, or is it more likely that he was using those drugs at night while he's at a party with his friends? We know from Ms. Gamboa, the next part of her testimony is that Mr. Knight walks back to the car and Walt comes with him. And we know that, again, Walt she hears Walt say, don't worry about it, I've got this. Which fits in perfectly with Mohammed's knowledge of what had happened between Walter and Armando, and Mohammed offering to take care of that for Walter, and Walter saying no. We know that he gets in the car, Ms. Gamboa next testifies that Mr. Knight gets in the car and he says, quote, let's change the vibe here. Let's change the vibe here. Maybe that was nothing. Maybe that was just a throwaway line. Or maybe it suggests that Mr. Knight was upset over something that he learned at the party. Ms. Gamboa's next piece of testimony is that she sees as she's sitting there and they're getting ready to leave, she sees a gold car whipping around her. Think about for a second why she's telling you this. Right? She's telling you that because it makes it sound like Demetrius and Armando are whipping around her. They're rushing to get to the stop sign so that they can get there first. But we know that never happened. We know it. We know it for two reasons. One, Wendy specifically denied ever seeing that car prior to it being at the intersection when she spoke with police, when she spoke with Officer Schlosser that night. Officer Schlosser asked her, had you seen the car at the party? She says, I don't know. And two, we know that Armando and Demetrius were parked on the side of the house. They were parked on the side of the house where Terra Road was, facing that intersection. We know it from Demetrius' testimony, we know it from Walter's testimony, and we know it from Corey's testimony. All of them say he was parked on the side of the house. Armando and Demetrius, all they got to do is get into that car and drive a couple hundred yards forward to Miramar Parkway. It's Wendy and Mohammed that have to back up and turn around in order to get that way to Miramar Parkway. So Wendy testifies next, and well, before I go on to that, I think this part of Wendy's testimony is a perfect metaphor for her entire testimony, right? She creates this fact, this nugget, that makes Armando Demetrius sound scarier than it happened. A fact that she either didn't tell prior police officers or told the opposite to prior police officers. And it's a fact that we know is not true. Wendy next testifies that Mohammed is in his car, and at this point they have a choice, right? They're facing west there on Claridge Road. In order to get to Miramar Parkway, they can just go straight and make a left, which is what you see, what little you see in the surveillance video of people doing. Or he can back up, turn around, in order to go down Terra Road that way. Mohammed tells her to back up, turn around, and go south on Terra Road that way. So Mohammed has Wendy follow Demetrius and Armando's car to the stop sign. The car, she next testifies that the car is sitting there for a few minutes, and that they pull up to the Impala that's in front of her, and she testifies they're there for a few minutes before Mohammed honks the horn and gets out of the car. Sounds rather ominous, right? Sounds like Demetrius is sitting there inviting this somehow by staying parked at that stop sign. So we've got to look at what she said about that in the past. And on the night of the incident, to Detective Schlosser, she never, not once, mentions that Impala, that they were waiting behind that Impala for any time at all. She says they pulled up to the Impala and Mr. Knight got out. Then on May 9th, 2 weeks later, she tells Detective Bertrand, and she admitted to this, quote, I was pulling up to the stop sign, and there was this car sitting at the stop sign in front of us, and then we were there for like 2 seconds. Mo says, hold on, he taps the horn. So this is what she says 4 years ago, but then she comes in here and tells you, the jury, we were waiting there for a few minutes. It just didn't happen. She's making it up to make Armando and Demetrius look like they were inviting this somehow. This point in her testimony, I asked Ms. Gimbolas, I said, I have to ask you $1 million question. Why didn't you just go around the car? If you're supposedly sitting there and waiting for several minutes, why didn't you just go around the car? And her answer was striking. She said, well, because it's the law, isn't it? You get to decide for yourself whether you think that was credible or not. But I would submit to you that a woman who allowed Mohammed Knight to ride in her car with an open cup of vodka, who allowed Mohammed Knight to snort up cocaine in her car, is not going to have a problem with going around the car at stop sign. Everyone would have driven around that vehicle. People with good intentions don't just stay there and then get out of the car. If there was a wait, they would have gone around it. There was no wait. Mohammed got out of that car immediately. When Ms. Gimbolas next testifies, of course, that, and we've talked about this, that Mr. Knight gets out of the car. Who in their right mind gets out of that car to walk to a stranger's car in front of them? She says he does that. Ms. Gimbolas says, oh, he does that all the time. Really? You're telling me that this man gets out of the car at intersections to talk to random strangers in the car in front of him? That's how you want to explain this? If you believe that that Mohammed Knight got out of that car because he always got out of cars in order to talk to the friendly strangers in front of him, then I've got to bridge the subject. It simply didn't happen like that. We know next that Ms. Bimbolis testifies that Mohammed shouted Walt, which is probably true. She didn't know the ramifications of that when she said that. But we know, of course, that Mr. Knight had just offered to Walter to dust up Armando, and now he's shouting at Walt, "Hey, I'm going towards this car." He's essentially notifying Walt that, hey, this is what I'm going to do. The next part of Wendy's testimony is that the passenger gets out at the same time. She says Armando got out of the car at about the same time as Mohammed. And I want you to think about that reasoning for a second, right? If Armando gets out of the car at the same time as Mohammed, then it makes it sound a whole lot like Armando was looking for some kind of confrontation. Makes Armando sound scared. We know that didn't happen. Armando never got out of that car. Demetrius told you he never got out of that car. And we can't trust Wendy on that because Wendy's statements themselves about that have changed. On May 9th of 2014, to you she says he immediately got out of the car. That the passenger got out of the car right after Mohammed got out of the car. On May 9th of 2014, she tells Detectives Bertrand and Zeller that the passenger gets out of the car before Mo even gets to past the gas tank. Change. Then on June 25th, 2016, during a deposition, Ms. Bimbolis says, just as he got to their back bumper, Baptista got out. But to you, she says they got out at the same time. Her story is changing because it simply didn't happen. That's why she doesn't recognize him. That's why she thinks he has a big afro, and that's why she never saw a hat, because he never got out of the car. She says next that Armando walks. She says Armando, in her testimony to you, she says Armando walks towards Mohammed. And that they met at the gas tank, which is where this confrontation began. Again, look at her previous statements. That night to Detective Schlosser, she never tells Schlosser that Armando walks toward Mohammed. That night to Detective Bertrand and Zeller, she never tells them that Armando walks toward Mohammed. And on May 9th, she told again Detectives Bertrand and Zeller that it was Mohammed that walked toward Armando. But now in this trial, she tries to make Armando sound as scary as she possibly can by saying Armando walks toward Mohammed. Her story is changing because it never happened. Armando never got out of that car. At this point, and the state argued this strongly during their closing, at this point Wendy testifies that while they're outside the car and talking, she sees Mohammed Knight try to shake Armando's hand. This is super, super important. Think about this for a second. Mr. Knight, who we know is on cocaine and flocka, and wanted just a few moments before to kick the crap out of Armando for hitting Walter, who then Mohammed had gotten out of his car and approached Armando's car. Now all of a sudden, Mr. Knight just wants to shake Armando's hand. That in and of itself defies logic. It defies common sense. Wendy is telling you that because if Mohammed was just trying to shake Armando's hand, then Armando had no reason to stab him. Right? Armando must have been the aggressor. If all Mohammed was doing was trying to shake his hand, Armando must have been the aggressor. We know that attempt at a handshake never happened. Demetrius said it never happened. Armando said it never happened. And Wendy herself, in three separate times that she spoke with police, never said anything about an attempt. Schlosser, she never said an attempt at a handshake. Bertrand and Zeller, she never mentioned an attempt at a handshake. And on April 28th, when she talked to Detective Arbelayes, she never mentioned an attempt at a handshake. But for you, 4 years later, as these jurors, all of a sudden, yeah, Mr. Knight, all he was doing was trying to shake Armando's hand. That's it. She didn't tell those first three police officers about that because it didn't happen. The gas tank. Now it's important to understand where Wendy says this begins. She says that they're standing at the gas tank, and that's where Armando throws a punch. She then says she gets out of their car, and now Mohammed is on top of Armando inside the Impala. How in the world do they get from a fist fight at the gas tank to Mr. Knight on top of Armando inside the passenger seat of the car? These are two 6'2" thereabouts men, supposedly in a fist fight, standing up outside the car, and then all of a sudden, magically, they're inside the car, and Mohammed's on top of Armando. And she didn't even try to explain that to you. She didn't even try. There was no testimony to try to explain how these two grown big men could end up in that position. You could probably try to recreate this and have two grown men get into a fist fight 100 times starting at the gas tank, and you'd never end up with what we have here. With Armando literally lying on his back with his head halfway back into the back seat and Mr. Knight on top of him. They have the obligation to prove to you how that happened. They didn't. Wendy didn't even try because it's impossible. It couldn't happen. When Ms. Kimbolis next says that she walks up to the car and she sees Mohammed on top of Armando. Obviously, this story is true. We all agree with that. Everyone agrees with it. Everyone who's there agrees that Mohammed was on top of Armando. And in contrast to her other statements, she told Detective Schlosser that night. She hadn't thought through yet, I think, the self-defense plan. She's trying to say to the detectives, oh, it was self-defense for Mohammed, but didn't think through, oh gosh, what does it mean that Mohammed is on top of Armando inside the car? She next testifies that Mr. Knight didn't look like he was hurt inside the car, which is also probably true. He's got this flocka running through his system, and he's not feeling the pain. Even while Armando's stabbing him to try to get him off, he's not slowing him down. She testifies she's standing at the door and she hears Armando say, "Who is this, G? Who is this, G?" Wendy said that. That's important. He's screaming for help, asking, "Who is this?" That's consistent with what Demetrius' testimony was, and it's consistent with what Mr. Baptista's statement was. But think about this for a second. If Armando Baptista had started this fight, why would he in the middle of the fight be asking, "Who is this? Who is this?" Who starts a fight with somebody and then halfway through the fight recognizes, you know what, I don't know who this guy is, I'm not really sure why I'm fighting him. It lacks all common sense. What does make more sense is if you were attacked by somebody you don't know And it is completely surprising you for one of the things for you to be screaming is, who is this guy? Who is this? And that came from Wendy. It didn't just come from Demetrius and Armando. It came from Wendy. Next, Miss Gamboa says that she pulled Muhammad up out of the car. All 5'2" of her pulled the 228-pound Muhammad off of Armando. That, to me, simply defies logic and common sense. But you certainly should use you get to decide how to weigh that credibility. Next, she says that she sees a confrontation outside the car after she's pulled Armando out of the car. She says at that point that Demetrius and Armando start again beating on Mr. Knight. You know that that's not true. First of all, Demetrius, who is sick with this myasthenia gravis, with this neurological disorder, could barely chew his own food, never mind get up and start punching and kicking Mr. Knight. Second, we know that Mr. Knight didn't have any bruising whatsoever on his torso, on his arms, on his back, on his legs, that would remotely suggest that that had happened. And third, if Armando had gotten out of the car right there and then got back in the car, wouldn't he have picked up his hat? He literally would have had to step over his hat in order to get back into the driver's seat, back into the passenger seat, under what Wendy says happened. But he never got out of the car. As soon as Muhammad gets out of that car, he slams the door, which is exactly why that hat would be left right there. And finally, we know it's not true because both Demetrius and Armando told you they never got out of the car. And Armando literally just, Muhammad gets out of the car, Armando slams the door, and they leave. Next, Wendy testifies that when she goes back to her car and tries to call 911, but her battery had fallen out of the car. Right? She says she threw her phone or something and the battery fell out, and that's why she couldn't call 911. Now, this was 2000. I realize it's not 2018, but it was 2014. It wasn't 2004. I don't know what kind of phone she had. I don't know if they still make phones in 2014 where the batteries fall out. But I think it's very, very difficult to believe that the battery from her phone just happened to fall out at the one moment that she needed to try to call 911. And if she's not telling the truth about that, what else is she telling the truth about? Next, she says that she hears Armando essentially making some threats at Muhammad outside the car. We know that didn't happen because Wendy never told Detective Schlosser that happened that night. Wouldn't that be the first thing that you'd say? He beat up my boyfriend, he stabbed my boyfriend, and then he said he was going to come back, whatever it was. You're dead. You're dead. That's what you tell the police officer. He didn't tell Detective Schlosser. She didn't tell Detective Schlosser that night. She couldn't identify Armando. She tried to say he had a big afro and didn't have a big afro. The reason for that is because he never got out of the car. She never saw him outside that car. The last thing that she testified to is that when Mr. Knight gets out of that car, he's angry. He doesn't seem like he's hurt. He's yelling at her. And that's consistent with Armando's story. That's consistent with Muhammad being on Flocka at the time. He's being stabbed and not feeling pain. He's not stumbling out and weak at that point. He's still out and giving orders and yelling until he gets to the next yard over. Make no mistake, Wendy Gamboa's was their star witness, completely reliant on her testimony to try to show that this was not self-defense. And the question for you is whether you believe Wendy's testimony beyond all reasonable doubt. How can we believe this story that has so many contradictory versions of what she said in the past? How can we believe this story when sometimes it literally makes no sense? How can we believe this story when it is directly contradicted by the physical evidence? She says she never saw a bottle. There's a bottle there. Her story doesn't make sense. The state's case doesn't make sense. You should not rely on her testimony to make a decision of this magnitude. There is no way that her story can convince anyone beyond a reasonable doubt of anything. The state put on a whole lot of evidence. For the remainder of my time, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of that evidence. They called 20-something odd witnesses, most of whom were not there at the time of the incident. They put on a video surveillance that, with all due respect to the state attorney, was an hour of showing nothing, other than the little corner at the time of the fight. It looks like, or time after the fight, it looks like you could see some figures running away. No evidentiary value at all. They put on a lot, but don't dare think that because they put on all of this stuff, that means you should find him guilty. The judge told you when he was reading the instructions, the evidence that's given to you is not dependent on the number of witnesses that the state calls or the number of pieces of evidence that they present to you, but on the quality of that evidence. That's the word that the instructions use. And there was no quality to most of this evidence. There is no basis in fact or reality that would suggest that the evidence presented had any enough quality to convict them. They had their own witnesses contradicting each other. Wendy contradicted herself. The police couldn't get their story straight about the red Solo cup. They showed you an hour-long surveillance video that showed nothing. They put on a lot, but there was no quality to it. I want to talk for a few minutes and respond to some of the points in the state's closing. First of all, this notion about the beer bottle, about the bottom of the beer bottle matching something on the victim's face. That was, I would call it junk science, but it wasn't even science. It was junk argument. The judge told you that you can only rely on the evidence that was presented in front of you. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that was presented that anything on his face matched anything on a beer bottle. None. And it doesn't. If the medical examiner thought that there was something on the victim's face that resembled a beer bottle, he would have told you. If they had an expert that could have said the bottom of the beer bottle matches something on the victim's face, they would have told you. But now at the 11th hour, she comes up on closing to try to say, oh, look, there's this, the bottom of the beer bottle, and it matches something on his nose. It's junk. It didn't. And you can't make your decision based on what I say right now, and certainly not based on what she said during his closing. You can only do it based on the evidence. And that was not in the evidence. The state argued that that Demetrius and Armando, she used the word fleeing a couple times. They fled the scene. They weren't fleeing the scene. They were fleeing the man who had just attacked them. And as Demetrius told you, he was worried about people from the house coming back down. They are literally getting out of there, away from this fight, as quickly as they can. The defense photos. The state tries to get up here during her closing argument and try and, I guess, argue that we fabricated these photos. I mean, that's her argument, is that that someone punched Armando in the mouth in order to create that, and that we're just recreating these photos. Never mind the fact that the injury to his mouth is consistent with even the injury that's left over there 2 weeks later. But she tries to say, oh look, he's pale in this photo and he's tan in the other photo, and so the photos must be fabricated somehow. Well, first of all, he's not pale in this photo. She showed you this one. She didn't show you this one. He's not pale in this one. And second of all, anybody who's ever had their picture taken knows if you've got a close-up and you've got a flash, it's going to reflect off the person's face. And so there's light, actual light in these photographs illuminating his face, and they want to say that the pictures that they took in the dark for whatever reason somehow suggest that this is not the same person not the same person that they had somehow fabricated these prior photographs. First of all, if you want to make that argument, you should probably take his picture in the light instead of in the dark like this. They want to say, I mean, what are they trying to say, that he magically created his hairline in order to fabricate these photos? It makes no sense. And like I said, if they wanted to take photos, if they want to make this argument, they've got to take better photos than this. That is a argument that shows that they're grasping at straws. Oh, and by the way, in the picture that they took, he's got a receding hairline here, the one that's actually in the light, and he's a lot lighter in this picture. So for them to try to show you these dark pictures and show somehow that there's a fabrication here, that they punched him in the face and they gave him a head injury, I think just very much goes to show the strength with which they view their own case. Now, the state of Florida has the absolute burden in this case. They must prove to you beyond all reasonable doubt, and I respectfully disagree with the state, that the state says that they only have to prove to you beyond all reasonable doubt that he committed manslaughter. That is, under the instructions, there is more that they have to prove, and I will show you. So this is the self-defense instruction, justifiable use of deadly force. if you go to the very end of that, the next to last line, if in your consideration of the issue of self-defense, you have a reasonable doubt on the question of whether the defendant was justified in the use of deadly force, you should find the defendant not guilty. They have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond all reasonable doubt, that he was not acting in self-defense. Not just that he committed a manslaughter and then we have to prove self-defense. We do not have to prove anything. They've got to prove that it wasn't self-defense. And they certainly have not done that. Let's talk about the physical evidence and all of the ways that they failed to prove what happened that night. We know about the red Solo Cup. Would have been very, very easy for them to find out if that was involved or not. Fingerprint it, DNA test it. That would have shown whether it was involved in this incident or not. They didn't do that. The bottle, whose fingerprint is on the bottle? They find a fingerprint on April 30th, and then it essentially disappears. Before we make this decision, shouldn't we know whose fingerprint that was? The DNA on the bottom of the bottle that's found in the car. It's just lying there. Armando tells prosecutors he was hit over the head with a bottle. Lo and behold, there's a bottle sitting on the seat of the car. Before we make this decision, shouldn't we know if Armando's DNA is on that bottle? But it was $100. $100 to run a DNA test. So we're not going to do it. Never mind the bottom of the bottle. What about the rest of the spout itself, right? So they test the little mouth of the spout where somebody drinks out of. But we saw there were 2 pieces of that spout found on the scene there. And there was no DNA testing done of that second broken off piece. They didn't dust the outside of the passenger car door for any fingerprints to see if Mohammed had opened up the door. And that's a question, we'll never know the answer as to whether Mr. Knight's fingerprints were on that car door, a week later after they find it. But the reason we're never going to know the answer is because police, A, didn't dust it for fingerprints, and then B, sprayed it with luminol, so they could never dust it for fingerprints, right? Officer Peluso testifies by the time she gets there, it's already been sprayed with luminol. She would have liked to have dusted the outside of that car for fingerprints, but it's been sprayed with luminol by a prior police officer, rendering the ability of the police to get a fingerprint off that passenger side door impossible. Before we make this decision, shouldn't we know if any of Mr. Knight's fingerprints are on that passenger side door? Is another question we don't know the answer to. Is Armando's DNA underneath Mohammed's fingernails? Right? They've got the fingernail scrapings. They've got swabs from his fingers. They've got the bags that his hands were in. And those swabs are literally sitting somewhere right now in the Miramar Police Department. They're in an evidence locker. But it costs $100 to run a DNA test. The hat, Mr. Komar said there was a major contributor and a minor contributor to that hat. They said the major contributor was Armando Baptista. Who's the minor contributor? Maybe it was somebody, from his family who had the hat. Or maybe it was the guy that knocked it off his head. Before we make this decision, shouldn't we know that? And the failure here not a failure, the conscious decision here not to test this stuff is perfectly summed up by Detective Bertrand's testimony when I was cross-examining him. He told you, he told me, he told you, we found out who. Once we find out who this was, we stop. We're done. We should know more than who. They should be investigating more than who. We need to know that they're not interested in the what happened, or the why it happened. And because it costs $100 a piece for these DNA tests, they just say, you know what, we found out who, we got our guy, we're done. Well, the question for you is not who. It's what and why. What happened and why it happened. And you, thank you, Judge, and you don't have those answers because they didn't run these tests. We've talked about the facts. I want to talk for in the remainder of time that I have left about the law. So let me grab my highlighter. So this is the law as to justifiable use of deadly force. And the law says that the use of deadly force is justifiable only if the defendant reasonably believes that the force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself while resisting another's attempt to murder him. We have that here. Mr. Baptista is literally fighting for his life. Or, and this is important that this is or, we don't have to prove all of these things, we just have to prove that, we don't have to prove anything, they have to prove that it didn't happen. Let me correct myself there. Or any attempt to commit aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary upon him. So, what this means is, the law says that even if you are not in fear of being murdered, maybe you come to the conclusion, you know what, I don't think he was in fear that he was going to die that night. You are still allowed to use great bodily force to defend yourself if you think you're going to be the victim of one of these three things: aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary. Any one of those, and he's entitled to use self-defense. You've got all three. You've got the instructions for aggravated battery right afterwards. Aggravated battery is, it's actually right here. Fokker D. Knight intentionally touched or struck Armando Baptista against his will. Fokker D. Knight is committing the battery. While committing the battery, used a deadly weapon. We have those here. He touched or struck Mr. Baptista. He had a bottle in his hand. You've also got an aggravated assault. Aggravated assault is very similar to a battery, but assault is threatening somebody. Fokker D. Knight intentionally or unlawfully threatened to do violence to Armando Baptista. At the time, Fokker D. Knight appeared to have the ability to do so. The act of Fokker D. Knight created in the mind of Armando Baptista a well-founded fear that the violence was almost to take place. The assault was made with a deadly weapon. Mr. Knight has a bottle in his hand. He's literally trying to stab Mr. Baptista with it. He was in fear of an aggravated assault. He can use deadly force. Third, if he's fighting off a burglary. Burglary sounds weird. We think of a burglary as somebody breaking into your house. But it can also be somebody breaking into your car. And a burglary is simply entering, in this case, entering a conveyance owned by or in the possession of Demetrius Elder and or Armando Baptista. And two, at the time of entering that conveyance, Fokker D. Knight had the intent to commit a battery or assault in the conveyance. So it doesn't even need to be that Mr. Knight ever touched Mr. Baptista. If Mr. Knight enters into that car with any part of his body, and he does so with the intent to commit a battery, to hit him, or to commit an assault, to threaten him, then Mr. Baptista can use deadly force to defend himself. And that's what he did. All three of these apply. He's entitled to use that deadly force. The judge has told you that, going back to the description of homicide, a justifiable homicide. This comes in line with the self-defense, falls right in line. The killing of a human being is justifiable homicide and lawful if necessarily done while resisting an attempt to murder or commit a felony upon the defendant, or to commit a felony in any occupied vehicle in which the defendant was in at the time of the killing. We know Mr. Baptista was in that vehicle. We know Mr. Knight entered into that vehicle. And we know he committed a felony and certainly intended to commit a crime when he came into that car. This is textbook self-defense. Finally, the last part I want to point out is this. If Armando Baptista was in an occupied vehicle where he had a right to be, he is presumed to have had a reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or another if Fokker D. Knight had unlawfully and forcibly entered that occupied vehicle and the defendant had reason to believe that had occurred. The defendant had no duty to retreat under such circumstances. The second part refers to Mr. Knight, a person who unlawfully and by force enters or attempts to enter another's occupied vehicle is presumed to be doing so with the intent to commit an unlawful act involving force or violence. We know Mr. Knight was in that vehicle. Mr. Knight had no legal justification to be in that vehicle. He came in there to do harm to Mr. Baptista, and so under this law, under the law, Mr. Baptista is presumed to have had that fear. We don't have to prove to you that he had the fear. They have to prove to you that he didn't, and the law says he's presumed to have had that fear. Because when somebody comes into your car, or the car that you are lawfully in, that is scary, and you can defend yourself. Now, for the state to get a conviction here, for you to find Mr. Baptista guilty, you would have to know beyond all reasonable doubt that he wasn't acting in self-defense. We believe very, very strongly that the evidence has proven that he was acting in self-defense. But we don't have to prove that. So if you get back there and you go through all this and you talk about it and you are not convinced that he wasn't acting in self-defense, you have to find him not guilty. If you go back there and you think Mr. Baptista might have been acting in self-defense, but you're not sure, you must find him not guilty. If you go back there and you can't figure out what the hell happened, there's too many conflicting stories, you don't know what happened, and you're not proven beyond all reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. If you go back there and you think, for whatever reason, you know what, I don't think he was acting in self-defense, meaning Armando, but I'm not sure beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. That's the law. That's what we have in a criminal case to make sure that innocent people don't get convicted. You can't convict someone unless you're absolutely sure beyond all reasonable doubt that they're guilty. There's no way we have that here. I'm about 2 minutes from being concluded. I spent a whole lot of time talking about the facts in the case and arguing many of the facts and what the facts mean as far as what the state is presenting. But there's one fact that I can't fight. And it's a fact that certainly can elicit sympathy from anyone. Fakhruddin Mohammed Knight is dead. And I cannot begin to imagine the anguish that his family must feel. And for whatever his faults, he did not deserve to die that way. But Armando did not mean to kill him. He just wanted him to stop. And you can't use any natural sympathy that you may feel in making your decision. The law prohibits it. I want to end with Armando's own words. He said in his statement, quote, the broken bottle is like this close to my face, and I'm holding him. And I'm screaming for help, and I'm screaming for help, and I'm telling him, please stop, please stop. And he was determined. He had this look in his face. I don't know what he was on, but oh Lord, I don't know. I kept screaming, and he wouldn't stop. Ladies and gentlemen, that's self-defense. On April 25th, 2014, Armando Baptista had the most terrifying night of his life. All he was trying to do was go home to his wife and kids. Instead, he found himself trapped underneath a stranger inside the passenger seat of the car. You have the opportunity here to do something that most people never do. Armando Baptista is not guilty. And in this today, find him out.